Hello, and thank you for tuning into this week's episode of Bite Size Cybercrime, the podcast where we discuss cybercrimes and cybersecurity news. This week we'll be talking about a new and also kind of old method that spammers have been using to bypass email security filters. And oddly enough, it's actually becoming worse with the introduction of large language model-based AI spam filters. I thought it may have just been me, but I have noticed a lot more scam emails getting through to my corporate email lately, and I don't think I'm alone in this either. These days, pretty much every company throws some kind of AI thing in their product and insists it's the answer to most problems it has, but in this particular case, it may actually be causing more problems indirectly. How exactly is that possible? We need to talk a little bit about how email scams work. Email scams are pretty common. We've all received at least one if you've ever had an email address that's signed up for literally anything. You've ended up on some kind of list that's been sold to data brokers and stolen by scammers at some point along the way. And I've noticed somehow that more of these fake emails are ending up in just my regular inbox and not my spam inbox. So what is going on here? A secure email gateway is basically a security guard for your inbox. Secure email gateways check for a couple things like authentication, same how a security guard would check your ID at a bar. They use something called DKIM, also known as Domain Keys Identified Mail, to verify whether the email address is a legitimate one for what it claims to be. One thing that's really hard and has always been really hard for secure email gateways is determining context. Humans, at least most humans, tend to be pretty good at determining context and deciding whether something is suspicious based on the presentation. Of course, this doesn't always work, after all people do get phished still, but we're still able to identify when something seems off within an email. A random reward for doing seemingly absolutely nothing is pretty suspicious. Being asked to send money to a random stranger in order to receive more money, allegedly, is also pretty suspicious. And none of this language has really changed. Rather, it's been watered down. And what do I mean by watered down? Well, it turns out some hidden text within emails is tricking modern secure email gateways into thinking that the email is legitimate. Secure email gateways are meant to know some of the suspicious terminology such as urgent or rewards, but they don't see emails in the same way that we see emails. When you're opening an email, sometimes there's visuals that will come up. Usually there is these days, like a logo, a header, a footer, maybe some custom colors. The secure email gateway isn't seeing any visuals, it doesn't have eyes. Instead, it basically just reads the code that the email is made up of, and that includes the text. But you can manipulate the HTML to add these random junk words within the email that are never actually displayed to the user. Oftentimes they're hiding behind some of these assets or just so far into the void the user would never scroll over to read them. These can change the context of the email, and the email security gateway doesn't really have a way to know if the user is seeing them. Changing the context can make the email seem less suspicious, and it may even be allowed through. This might mean taking a word like urgent or reward and throwing a completely benign word kind of in the middle of it so it doesn't throw any flags. But it can also mean inserting a lot of filler text to make it seem like it's just a story. This method of adding hidden text is called salting, and for some reason, most security email filters are pretty good at undoing salting, but large language models actually perform pretty poorly against salted emails. Salting is not a new method by any means. It's actually one of the absolute oldest methods for getting around filters, and you've probably used some form of salting yourself to get around things like censorships on different forums or web boards, or any other places on the internet where words might be censored, especially if you want to say bad words. According to security firm Barracuda, which creates a lot of these secure email products, salting basically floods the LLM agent with so much useless benign information that it essentially tricks it into being a completely innocent benign email. The LLM doesn't really read the email as a user would and isn't sure what text is hidden from the user, so it takes all of it very literally. And this is kind of by design. After all, you do want the LLM to be able to determine context, but of course, this can work against the model when it's used like this. Many people adopt things like AI spam filters with the assumption that they're going to be superior than traditional email spam filters, but that might not always be true, especially in this case. An attack that doesn't work on traditional filters may work on some of these if you're not necessarily expecting to encounter something like salting, especially not to this extent. I'm not saying completely ditch every AI spam filter. What I'm saying is don't make it your only defense against email spam because it's not going to work that way. Email security is a very difficult thing to roll into one nice little approach, and having a layered one is always going to be more effective. Not only should you be checking the context, but you should also be checking for domain legitimacy, validating any links within the email, and having people have to go through some secure gateway to open the links. You should look at the reputation of the email sender. You should see user visible content versus all of the content and compare it. Keyword detection is important, but it may be bringing us a little backwards. And relying on LLMs as a safeguard is not the safest, especially for keyword detection. If you think about it, LLMs are basically made to behave as people in a way. And in the same way that you can trick a person, you could trick an LLM. There's actually even more ways to trick an LLM that you probably can't use to trick a person, considering the whole hidden content thing. If a person were to see all that salted content, they would probably think this email is a whole bunch of nonsense and throw it out immediately. But the LLM is just seeing a random email with all of this random benign content. It doesn't really have the capacity to understand whether or not that's a weird thing to receive. It's just thinking, okay, this text is not malicious, we'll send it through. Something I never thought I would see with the rise of LLMs specifically is old phishing techniques coming back to be used against these advanced robots. Like I said, this can be worked around if you have an AI spam email detector that is able to intentionally go through with the correct approach, but it just seems like this isn't currently happening, and it's an oversight. According to Barracuda, millions of these emails using just salting are getting through to legitimate users despite these allegedly more advanced AI security filters. Given an email is probably the most common attack vector for at least the initial phase, it's really important that it's adequately protected. Thank you to the Register, Dark Reading, and SC World for information about these old attacks making a comeback. And of course, thank you for tuning into this week's episode of Bite Size Cybercrime, and until next time, stay secure.